Heidi, it's wonderful to be having coffee with you this morning. Our resident ESG expert, welcome to our coffee break.
Thank you.
There's been a lot of discussion, Heidi, recently about employment issues arising within the ESG framework, and I'm wondering if you can take us through some of those aspects.
Thank you, Sarah. Well, we generally see employment issues arise as part of the human capital aspect of ESG. So we're in a governance framework. E relates to environmental concerns, governance around integrity and governance and reporting frameworks. S is the social, so the extent to which an organisation has an impact on the communities around it, and the extent to which it is impacted by things that are happening in the local community and in the social and political sphere. So the human capital aspect of that's really related to an organisation's workforce or the workers that are in the value chain. So we talk about human capital being sort of squarely focused on how you sustainably and responsibly build the workforce you have into the workforce you want, so that the organisation can deliver on its strategic and community sort of obligations. So lots of employment issues come up, obviously, in the human capital sort of sphere. So what is the impact of diversity and inclusion on your organisation's performance? How are your employees and other stakeholders kind of influencing corporate, social and values-based agendas? Looking a lot recently at how culture within an organisation drives opportunity, but also can drive aspects of legal and reputational risk.
And I'd love to pick up on that point, actually, Heidi. The idea of culture being a positive but also potentially a negative or a risk is really fascinating, particularly in the space of gender equality, and I'm wondering if you could perhaps take us through what that really looks like and particularly what we're seeing in Australia in that space.
Yes, so as you're well aware, in Australia, sexual harassment and discrimination have been issues that have been carefully reviewed, but also we've seen a lot of legislative development in that space. And so following on from the Respect at Work report by the Sex Discrimination Commissioner Kate Jenkins a couple of years ago, organisations have been really encouraged and perhaps now forced to think about cultural drivers of sexual harassment and discrimination within their organisation. So we might come in a minute to the legal risks that flow from that, but we're certainly seeing organisations that are not addressing that cultural risk are facing increased community sort of analysis around their responses and how they're dealing with it. We've seen instances of investors really questioning organisations about what they're doing to reduce that risk. We're seeing stakeholder activism, stakeholders attending AGMs and wanting to know what organisations are doing about it. We've seen shareholder activism in the context of trying to influence whether directors are reappointed depending on how they've perhaps dealt with a particular response to sexual harassment. And obviously over time this can have an impact on long-term value.
Absolutely.
I think, you're also coming back a bit more in-house, obviously not dealing well with responses to sexual harassment claims or not doing enough to prevent it from happening in the first place is something that employees think about very carefully. So your capacity to attract and retain a really high quality workforce is I think a significant driver of trying to address these kind of cultural risks.
And so just picking up on what organisations are doing or can do to address gender inequality in particular, but these more acute risks around sexual harassment and discrimination, what are we seeing in that regard?
So one of the most recent legislative developments has been the imposition of the positive duty on employers to prevent sexual harassment, sex discrimination, gender-based harassment, and I think one of the key things employers need to think about is their risk assessment in the context of cultural drivers. So whereas organisations are perhaps more familiar with looking at structural causes of risk, they now need to think about what is it at our organisation culturally that might give rise to sexual harassment being something that's more likely to happen. So analysing whether you have a traditional structured hierarchy in which the leaders are mostly men, looking at the extent to which your promotions, recruitment, remuneration programs may embed gender inequality. We're seeing increased discussion and focus on the gender pay gap. Looking at how you or where your most vulnerable members of your workforce are. Where are the women working, at what times, in what kind of teams? Is there gender inequality in their leadership of those teams? Our LGBTQIA plus workers, our workers who don't speak English as a first language, they're all groups that are considered, and it's shown through the research, are more vulnerable. So what are you doing as an organisation to understand how your culture is lived and experienced by the most vulnerable groups? You may have, so for example, a reporting system. This is how you report sexual harassment. This is how you get information on how you report. But is that as easily accessible to the most vulnerable groups? Are they actually getting that information in a way that empowers them to speak up? All the contact officers, men, in respect of a team which is largely women who don't speak English as a first language, what's the likelihood they will use that? So doing that kind of real cultural analysis is something that I think is really important to do. I also think that the other thing that's a big shift you might comment on is transparency. So I think the move, or the research shows that organisations that speak more about what the risks are, the risk assessment they've undertaken, and what they're doing to prevent those risks, create a culture in which people feel more empowered to speak up, and then are more likely to raise issues, and then you as an organisation have an opportunity to deal with those and improve. So we're seeing organisations moving towards sharing that kind of information, and some of them doing so publicly.
Very much so.
So what are you seeing in that space?
It's a fascinating space. I think there have been views that have been quite black and white on this. My personal view is that it needs to be much more nuanced. And there are organisations that have put out reports on how many reports of sexual harassment they're seeing, how they've responded to those, have people been sanctioned for that behaviour. And that is proving to be very effective in terms of that reinforcing of people feeling empowered to come forward and feeling like their organisation is listening when these matters are raised. I think the other part of that is when you are settling a matter to do with sexual harassment, and the terms on which that occurs is a really interesting and fraught space, which requires a lot of deep thinking in terms of, as an organisation, what do you want to do about that? But also, when you've got a complainant and respondent in front of you, what will a complainant feel comfortable doing? So, for example, at the moment we are looking very closely at a tiered type, what we call an NDA, or a confidentiality agreement, which in some respects, at the highest level, you will let people say whatever they want to about the matter. And then you might look to having some restrictions on the terms of a settlement. And then, in fact, you'll have an entirely restricted document. So these things really do require some deep thinking. And there is now in Australia some helpful guidance on how you might approach those matters. But not an easy space for employers. So one that we are speaking a lot about at the moment and trying to guide people through it. So it's really interesting. I wanted to just take you back to the beginning. You talked a little bit about the value chain and some of the risks that are arising in that regard. Did you want to make any comments around that?
Yes, I think it's really important that organisations are starting to get a handle on the human rights issues that are arising in value chains, and in Australia for a couple of years we've had the Modern Slavery Act. We've got lots of organisations who are reporting, lots of organisations assessing risk and taking steps to address them. But the expectations, I think, are increasing. And, if we look to the trend overseas to move beyond just modern slavery, risk identification and reporting to much broader human rights due diligence, particularly in Europe, obligations to put together action plans and obligations in some circumstances for those to be public. It's really important that organisations are building that capacity to look at their supply chains. I think, another area in Australia that's of particular importance, and you see here you start to interlink, the E and the S, is organisations who are looking at renewable energy projects, often, or even transitioning from their own energy sort of supply through to something more renewable and environmentally friendly. There's a great deal of knowledge around the high levels of risk of modern slavery in the production of various components that are used in either solar or wind. So as you are perhaps working on a project that has a really positive environmental outcome, or you're looking as an organisation to reduce your environmental impact, what is that doing in the context of your S risk? How are you increasing your modern slavery risks as you're reducing your environmental risks? And building an understanding of how your organisation, perhaps in its supply chain, the way it interacts with its suppliers and what it procures, but also in terms of carrying out your operations or addressing some of your own risk, how are you increasing those risks to people throughout your value chain? And transparency, we talked about in the context of sexual harassment, is really one of the levers that is being used by regulators around the world to increase responsibility. So we've got modern slavery reporting. In Australia, we've now got a bill that seeks to introduce gender pay gap reporting.
Fascinating.
The ASX corporate governance guidelines do include some reporting requirements for large entities in the context of diversity. But the corresponding of that is we're also seeing now the potential for litigation in the context of not being, factually representing necessarily what an organisation is doing in the context of those topics. So if we look to the E, we see in Australia increased amount of climate change litigation, but we're also seeing quite a lot of greenwashing litigation. So litigation where organisations have made commitments to reducing their environmental impact, have transparently reported on what they're doing, and are now the subject of misleading and deceptive conduct claims to say they're not actually doing
and
what they said.
Is it right that this is now going to arise perhaps in the social space?
Well, that's what I think we need to be mindful of. As we're doing our modern slavery reporting, our human rights due diligence and our reporting on that, as we are sharing our corporate social responsibility reports sometimes that go to our diversity and what we're doing about it, as we report to our people and the public on the sexual harassment complaints we've dealt with and the kinds of outcomes and what we're doing, I think it's really important organisations are building a framework behind that to deliver on what they say they're going to do, because the transparency, really is driving improvements as our external and internal communities hold us to account for what we've committed to do. And I haven't even touched on all of the increasing trend, at least in Australia, towards more transparent reporting on environmental commitments and progress. And I would reach out to the E members of my ESG team to talk about that in far more
we might need to have a few
detail.
more coffees to capture all of that. I mean, this has been such a great conversation. In terms of crystal ball gazing and future predictions, I mean, what do we expect to see, just as a quick snapshot and summary in this area, perhaps in the next kind of 12 to 24 months? What are you expecting?
We are going to see, I think, increasing reporting requirements in the context of the S.
Yeah.
So certainly in Australia, the Modern Slavery Act is under review.
Okay.
There is clear consideration of penalties for. It's not clear actually what the penalties might be for, whether that's non-compliance in terms of not reporting at all or quality of reporting, but certainly the review is really looking at the extent to which organisations are meaningfully engaging in that reporting regime or are just sort of going through a tick-the-box exercise.
Yeah.
We've got our gender pay bill. We've got a lot of movement in the context of increasing the scope and particularity of environmental reporting. And I think the other thing we're sort of seeing in Australia is litigation that looks at the extent to which organisations have consulted with local communities, particularly traditional owners, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities in Australia, that is now starting to look at not just legal rights to consultation, but making sure that that consultation really includes aspects such as cultural rights and cultural use of land. And the final thing I would say is we're only going to see increasing stakeholder expectations.
Yeah.
Employees are telling employers how they expect their employers to drive social change agendas or at least contribute. External stakeholders, investors. We're seeing investors really look at their investments but also portfolio companies.
Yes.
What are those companies they're going to invest in or finance doing about these risks? That sounds all really scary, but I think the ESG framework gives an organisation the opportunity to really look at those risks, and in the S space particularly look at it with a human rights lens, doing human rights impact assessments. So putting all of that kind of scary stuff into a really well thought out framework that identifies from your organisation's perspective the impacts and opportunities and enables you to step back and look at them in an objective framework, I think is becoming more and more important.
Fascinating stuff, Heidi. Thank you so much for your time. Let's not let the coffee get cold and we'll enjoy a Tim Tam. Thank you.